What if the people seen as outsiders today were actually the first architects of civilization itself? We begin not in a modern border zone, but in the raw heartbeat of the ancient world, the Zagros Mountains, standing since before the first kingdom, before the first written word. This isn't a poetic exaggeration, it's a scientific fact. According to ADNA extracted from Wesmer Cave, WC1, dated between 7455 and 7082 BCE, the inhabitants of this region formed a distinct genetic population separate from the early Anatolian farmers who pushed west into Europe. These weren't just early adopters of agriculture, they were pioneers. And the modern descendants of these people? The Kurds. Multiple genomic studies, including mitochondrial DNA analysis from PubMed and BMC Genomics, reveal that Kurdish women still carry haplogroup H, 37.1%, and haplogroup U, 13.8%, lineages deeply rooted in the Neolithic Fertile Crescent, spanning 9,000 to 9,500 years ago. These are not faint echoes. They are active, breathing lineages, passed through generations of mothers, unbroken. And this isn't just maternal continuity. Paternal haplogroups like J2, dominant in Kurdish men, 28% frequency, especially in Sorani Kurds, directly link back to early Neolithic farming expansions from Anatolia and the Levant. This means Kurds hold both maternal and paternal imprints of the world's first farmers. And yet, mainstream narratives often reduce Kurdish identity to geopolitics or recent linguistics. Yes, Kurds speak an Indo-European Iranian language today, but language, like empire, is a layer. Genetics, that's the bedrock. Visualize this. While the pyramids were still 3,000 years away, Kurdish ancestors were domesticating goats, harvesting wild wheat, and building the foundations of settled life in the Zagros highlands. The DNA doesn't lie. They didn't just inherit civilization. They helped create it. But if their DNA carries the memory of the first farmers, why have they been treated like footnotes in the story of human civilization? Sometimes the greatest fortress is not made of stone, but of mountains. Maybe because the world forgot to look up. In the age of empires, conquest travelled fast, across plains, rivers, and open deserts. But in Kurdistan, nature had already carved a sanctuary out of rock. The Zagros and Taurus mountains, rising sharply like ancient walls, didn't just block armies, they guarded bloodlines. While Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Mongols and Ottomans stormed through Mesopotamia, the highlands remained stubborn, unyielding, and the DNA proves it. Despite 2 millennia of empire building, Kurdish genomes remain remarkably undisturbed. Studies based on YSTR analysis reveal that Sorani Kurds, especially, remain genetically closest to Qataris, Iraqis and Iranians, and furthest from distant outsiders like Swedes, Afghans and Ethiopians. That's not isolation by culture, it's what geneticists call isolation by distance. The more rugged the land, the slower the genes move. In these mountains, geography outlasted empire. Even the Kurdish diaspora in Georgia, displaced centuries ago, remains a genetic time capsule. Scientific sampling shows a strong founder effect, meaning their DNA barely mixed with locals. It's as if their genome remembered a home they no longer walked on. But this isn't just about science. In Kurdish life, traditions travel like heirlooms, carried in oral histories, protected by tribal endogamy, and woven into dialects untouched by globalization. This mirrors the DNA, stable, unbroken, enduring. Imagine generations of mountain families, reciting the same lullabies, farming the same soil, marrying within the same tribe, unknowingly preserving thousands of years of genetic memory. In a world reshaped by conquest, Kurdish DNA became the rare archive that resisted rewriting. But not everything in that genome tells the story we think we know. Because hidden within this preserved genome lies a secret that defies a cherished origin myth. What if one of the most sacred Kurdish origin stories was never about the Kurds at all? Here comes the twist, a twist powerful enough to shake centuries of belief. The story of the Medes, those fabled Indo-Iranian kings, often claimed as the proud ancestors of the Kurdish people, may be built on a misreading of both history and genetics. For centuries, Kurdish identity has been stitched to the idea that it bloomed from the Median Empire, which helped destroy Assyria in 612 BCE and rule parts of the ancient Near East. But when scientists peered into the ancient bones of the so-called Medes, specifically those uncovered at Tepe Hassanlu, a key site dated to around 800 BCE, what they found shattered that story. The Median genome was not pure Indo-Iranian, it was a genetic mosaic, a mix of steppe migrants and deeply rooted Zagrotian herders, meaning the Medes weren't a founding population, they were the newcomers. And here's the shock. Modern Kurds do not genetically descend from the Medes in any exclusive way. Their deepest genetic signature, especially on the maternal side, connects instead to Neolithic Zagros farmers living around 9,000 years ago, thousands of years before the Medes ever arrived. Mitochondrial DNA, particularly haplogroups H 37.1% and U 13.8%, reveals unbroken maternal lines from the 7th millennium BCE, long before any Indo-Iranian tongue was ever spoken. In fact, cutting-edge models from BMEC Genomics and PubMed show that Kurds have only a partial overlap with Median samples, and a far stronger link to Wesme cave genomes and early Zagros populations whose blood runs thick in modern Kurdish veins. So why the myth? Because the Medes carried power, language, imperial identity, and like many conquered peoples, Kurdish tribes may have absorbed that culture without inheriting the blood. The prestige of the Median name lived on, but the DNA did not. And this opens a haunting question. If the Median myth isn't the origin, then who truly wrote the genetic script of the Kurdish people, thousands of years before empires had names? In caves older than history, the Kurdish genome speaks. The answer begins in a cave. Not a myth, not a legend, a real cave, nestled deep in the Zagros Mountains, a place untouched by modern hands for over 9,000 years. That place is Wesme Cave, and inside it, archaeologists uncovered one of the most ancient human remains ever found in the region, a teenage individual, genetically frozen in time. Dated between 7,455 and 7,082 BCE, this specimen, labelled WC1, holds a genome unlike anything found in Europe or Anatolia. When geneticists sequenced the DNA, what they found shocked them. The WC1 shared no match with the famous Anatolian farmers who pushed westward to seed Europe's Neolithic age. Instead, this individual belonged to a completely separate lineage, one native to the Zagros, isolated, ancient, and still alive today. Because when they compared the data, that same genome, the same maternal markers, reappeared. In modern Iranian Zoroastrians, in Kurdish women, even faint echoes in populations of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The line was never broken, it simply lived on, silently, generationally, in the mountain womb that birthed it. Mitochondrial DNA doesn't lie. It's passed from mother to daughter, untouched by male influence. And this mtDNA from a girl buried before cities existed still pulses through the veins of Kurdish daughters today. Firelight flickering on limestone walls, goat hooves in the dark, the smell of stone, ash and fermented milk. The Neolithic scene may be gone, but the genetic memory is intact. And the twist. Autosomal DNA analysis shows that Kurds preserve this ancient substratum more clearly than even Turks or Persians, whose lineages were diluted by later waves of admixture. Kurdish DNA didn't just survive, it resisted transformation, which raises a question even more haunting than the last. But if the Kurds are genetic heirs of Neolithic innovation, how did waves of conquest leave their blood almost untouched? While conquerors marched, the women remembered. The answer isn't found on the battlefield, it's found in the womb. Because while armies came and fell, while swords clashed and kings changed, the Kurdish women stayed. And they remembered, not in scrolls or songs, but in their blood. This is where science tells a different story from the swordsman. Kurdish DNA reveals a striking asymmetry. While paternal haplogroups show signs of foreign infiltration, like R1a and R1b, linked to Indo-European and Central Asian elite migrations, the maternal side tells a story of ancient stillness. When scientists sequenced Kurdish mitochondrial DNA, the genetic line passed from mother to child, they found something powerful. The dominant maternal haplogroups were H, U, K, J, T, and W, all markers of Western Eurasian and Near Eastern origin, some going back over 9,000 years. This means something profound. The women who lived through every conquest, from the Achaemenids to the Ottomans, passed their genes down with remarkable purity. Their daughters carried the same DNA. Their granddaughters too, and so on. The men may have changed, but the mothers remained, preserving not just lineages, but language, rituals, midwifery practices, and ancestral memory. In Kurdish oral tradition, it is often the grandmother who holds the story, the healer who remembers the land, the mother who passes the unspoken laws. And here lies the emotional truth. Genetics has now confirmed what culture always knew, that Kurdish continuity lived through the women. But the silence of the mothers hides something else, because while their DNA stayed rooted, another signal appeared, a whisper, low but consistent, carried not by the women but by the men. But in this genetic silence of the women, whispers of an ancient brotherhood remain. Two peoples divided by religion, united by DNA. And that whisper echoes across centuries, across faiths, across exiles. A brotherhood hidden not in politics, but in chromosomes. At the intersection of ancient memory and modern science, a strange closeness appears between Kurds and Jews, and not just by geography, but by blood. In 2001, a genetic study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics revealed something few expected, that Kurdish Jews are genetically closer to Muslim Kurds than they are to some Jewish populations in the Middle East. The same study found Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews to be closer to Kurds than to Yemenite or Arab Jews, suggesting a shared ancestral core, possibly rooted in the northern Levant or Zagros Highlands. That changes everything, because it means these groups may have sprung from the same prehistoric seed population long before the lines of religion, empire or language were drawn. Look deeper, and the echoes grow louder. Both peoples share burial practices that emphasize stone enclosures, facing west, an ancient Mesopotamian tradition. They share priestly castes, like the Kohanim among Jews and hereditary peers among Kurds, both claiming sacred ancestry, pass through blood. Even fragments of Near Eastern mythology, fire rituals and linguistic parallels trace back to shared cultural soil, now scattered across faiths. It's as if Kurdish and Jewish identities are two branches of the same tree, split by storms of time, but still fed by the same root system, the ancient ark of Mesopotamia. One that predates Torah, Quran and nation state. And today, DNA has cracked open the silence that history tried to close. It shows that while faith divided, biology united, a truth that even politics couldn't erase. But this is not the only ancient bridge. Their DNA reveals you can change your tongue, but not your blood. Because sometimes the deepest connection hides behind the loudest contradiction. Take this one. The Kurdish language, Indo-European, Iranian in structure, tied by linguists to steppe migrations from Central Asia, dated roughly between 1800 to 1200 BCE. And yet, when scientists opened the genome, they didn't find the steppe in the centre. They found the Zagros. Modern autosomal DNA and uniparental markers place Kurds not with the linguistic family they speak, but with the genetic family they come from. A family closer to Hurrians, Levantine peoples, and ancient Mesopotamians than to the Indo-Iranian groups who brought the language in the first place. In fact, when researchers modelled Kurdish genomes using the whole sequence datasets, including work published in BMC Genomics 2022 and backed by PubMed meta-analyses, they found that Indo-Iranian ancestry appears mostly in the paternal lines. This means that elite male-mediated language spread occurred, where a small group of powerful outsiders changed the tongue of the people, but not their roots. This isn't a fringe idea. Geneticists have seen the same thing with the Hungarians, who speak a Uralic language, but carry mostly Central European DNA, or the Azerbaijanis, whose Turkic language masks Persian Caucasian ancestry. And now, Kurds. The evidence is undeniable. Despite their language, the Kurdish autosomal profile remains closer to ancient West Asian populations, with strong continuity from the Zagros Neolithic layer going back as far as 9000 BCE. The Indo-European steppe wave, so dominant in northern Iran or Central Asia, barely penetrated their maternal lines. The truth is hard, but beautiful, because it reveals a culture wrapped in layers, a people speaking one language but living another history. Culture is a costume, but DNA, that's the skeleton beneath it. So then, if the language spoke of one past, and the blood whispered another? And if language once masked blood, could blood now rewrite identity? What if the real story isn't purity, but survival? Only if we're honest, brutally honest, about what that blood truly carries. Because for years, a myth has circled quietly in corners of Kurdish nationalism and identity narratives. That of genetic purity, a proud, uninterrupted line. A people untouched by others. But the truth is far more compelling. The Kurdish genome was never pure, and that's what makes it powerful. Autosomal DNA analysis tells the story clearly. Kurds are not descended from a single ancestral group, but from layer upon layer of survival. A 2023 synthesis of genome-wide data revealed the Kurdish genetic composition as a mosaic, roughly 51% Zagros Neolithic farmer, 15% Levantine early agriculturalist, and up to 49% Indo-Iranian steppe ancestry. But these aren't random percentages, they're chapters. A people formed not by isolation, but by selective endurance. One group passes through, leaves a trace. Another arrives, leaves its culture. A third tries to erase both, but fails. And the proof lies deeper still, in the HLA haplotype profile, the genes that govern immunity and resistance. Kurdish populations show rare combinations like B52-DR, B1*15 and A02-B51-DR, B1*11, alleles rarely found together outside the ancient Near East. They're not signs of purity, they're signs of refined resistance, of immunity built through waves of exposure, not exclusion. This is what most narratives miss. Genetic uniqueness doesn't mean untouched, it means unmatched. The Kurdish genome is not a clean canvas. It's a tapestry woven through survival, siege and selective inheritance. Because survival, in the genetic sense, doesn't come from hiding in the mountains forever. It comes from standing in the storm, and somehow still being here. And yet, in a world obsessed with roots and origins, where entire cultures rise and fall on who arrived first. But as empires fall and languages die, can DNA alone keep a people's story alive? They carry history not in scrolls, but in their bones. Maybe the answer was never in books, but under the skin all along. Because the Kurdish story isn't just about who they are. It's about how their bodies have become archives, living maps of memory, stretching thousands of years deep. And here's the shocker. Despite being scattered across Iraq, Turkey, Iran and Syria, modern Kurds still form a tight genetic cluster, one that barely respects the modern borders drawn after World War I. You can see it in SMP data, in haplogroup continuity, in every lab that runs comparative genomes across West Asia. Kurdish groups consistently align along a shared axis, distinct from neighbouring Turks, Arabs or Persians. This isn't just data, it's a memory, biological memory. Because the haplogroup trees trace not just kinship, but migration patterns. Echoes of Zagros Neolithic lineages still flicker in modern Kurdish DNA. From haplogroup J2, linked to early farmers, to mtDNA haplogroup H, tied to maternal lines that have persisted unbroken since 7000 BCE. And it's not just in the cells, it's in the culture. The festival of Newroz lit by fire each March may seem political now, but its bones are prehistoric. A fertility ritual tied to springtime, traced by archaeologists to early Zagros communities. They lit fires to call back the sun. Kurds still light them. Unlike their neighbours, who absorbed waves of new blood from invaders, migrants, conquerors, the Kurds remained the genetic anchors of the region. They are not isolated. They are preserved. They are not ancient because they stayed behind. They're ancient because they endured. They don't just remember the Neolithic, they carry it. And now that we've cracked open the genome, now that we've seen what memory can live inside, mitochondria and alleles. And now, with the genome decoded, what other forgotten lineages are waiting to speak? Not every war is fought with weapons. Some are fought with memory. Start here, with silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from forgetting, but from being ignored, erased. Silenced not by time, but by maps, borders, flags. For too long, Kurdish identity has been narrated by others, refracted through empire, denied by nations, overlooked by textbooks. But their DNA never stopped speaking. It carried a message, encrypted in alleles, passed through mothers and fathers, quietly resisting erasure. It says, we were here, before the Bronze Age, before the Bible, before kings and conquest. What lives in Kurdish blood isn't just Zagros Neolithic ancestry, it's a story of refusal. A refusal to be erased, absorbed, rewritten. A genome that survived invasions by Assyrians, Achaemenids, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Turks, Mongols and modern states, and still retained allelic signatures older than most civilizations. Today, while nationalism redraws maps with ink and ideology, genetic science redraws them with truth. Kurdish genomes don't argue for supremacy. They whisper endurance, not superiority, but continuity. And this continuity, this soft resistance encoded in flesh, is now challenging the very idea of who belongs where. Because the real frontier isn't between Iran and Iraq, it's between memory and forgetting. So what happens when science steps into this silence? When a genome tells a deeper truth than any passport? It rewrites belonging. It disrupts myth. It recenters stories, not on power, but on persistence. The Kurdish genome, once buried beneath centuries of conflict, now rises, not as a banner, but as a beacon. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful legacy is simply still being here. And in the next episode, we journey into another forgotten genome, one that may rewrite the story of the ancient world once again.